So, in Amitav Ghosh's novel Gun Island, there's this really fascinating idea at its core. What if ancient folklore actually holds the key to understanding our most complex modern problems? We're going to dig into how this story suggests that myths aren't just relics of the past, but are actually essential tools for our future. The story immediately challenges us with this central question. We're so used to seeing the world in these simple binaries, East against West, myth against science. But what happens when those clear lines start to get blurry? And we realize they might not have been real to begin with. All right, so let's start with that classic duel, East versus West. We're about to see how this isn't just some grand, abstract clash of civilizations, but something that plays out in the small, everyday interactions between people. We're all familiar with these simplified boxes, right? The East is often painted as spiritual, mystical, driven by stories, while the West is seen as rational, individualistic, and all about technological progress. This is that classic, kind of Eurocentric viewpoint, a leftover from what's known as Orientalism, and it creates a really powerful and often damaging internal narrative. So take this character, Dinanath. He's a scholar who just got back to India with a PhD from America. When one of his relatives uses his childhood nickname Dinu, he gets deeply offended. In his mind, his Western education and his status as an NRI, that's a non-resident Indian, entitles him to a whole different level of respect. He's desperate to be modern, to leave the boy he was far, far behind. Dinanath's reaction is just a perfect example of what's called the colonial mindset. And this isn't just about dusty history books. It's this living, internalized belief that your own culture is somehow inferior, and that Western benchmarks, like a PhD or speaking a certain way, are the true measure of a person's worth. So what feels like a personal insult to him is actually a symptom of a much larger psychological thing. But the novel doesn't let that idea sit for long. It immediately challenges it. So let's move on and see how the story builds on this by introducing a character who just completely refuses to fit into these neat little boxes. Okay, so the novel then drops us into a scene that feels almost stereotypical. You have an elderly woman in rural India, and she's telling this fantastical story about a local shrine, a goddess, and a merchant from a long-gone era. Our first instinct, being influenced by all those stereotypes, might be to just dismiss her. We think, oh, okay, an old woman telling ancient stories. It's just superstitious, silly stuff. It's so easy to just assume she's disconnected from the rational, modern world. But that assumption gets completely shattered almost immediately. See, this isn't just any village elder. This is Neelima Bose, and she is a powerhouse. We're talking respected by politicians, celebrated by the press, and she's the founder of a huge, super effective charitable trust. Her credibility is literally beyond question. And this is the crucial point. Her deep connection to myth doesn't make her irrational. In fact, it's presented as the very source of her wisdom. She proves that logic and legend aren't enemies. They can and absolutely do coexist in a really powerful way. And this leads us right to the novel's central argument. It's not about which side is better. It's about seeing that we need everything working together. The word versus is the problem. The solution is the word and. For instance, take the character Chinta. She's a historian. When she hears the myth, she doesn't just wave it off. Instead, she applies her historical knowledge, deciphers the ancient place names in the story, and realizes they refer to real locations, like the island of Sicily. She grounds the myth in actual fact. Then you've got Pia Lee, who brings in a scientific lens. She hears about these mythical snakes and spiders moving across the land, and she explains how these events could totally correspond to real-world ecological patterns and animal migrations, maybe even triggered by climate events. Science provides a physical explanation for the myth's strangest parts. And finally, we come back to Dinanath, our initial skeptic. Despite all his Western training, he is the keeper of the original myth. It's his story that provides the framework, the narrative that connects Chinta's history and Piali's science into one coherent, meaningful whole. And this is the holistic perspective. The novel is arguing that to truly understand our world, we just can't afford to choose. We need the intuitive storytelling of the East and the rational inquiry of the West. By fusing myth, history, and science, you get a much deeper, much more complete picture of what's really going on. So if we accept this holistic view, what do we do with it? Well, the novel's final and maybe its most important argument is that we have to use these ancient storytelling tools to make sense of the crises of our own time. To do this, the author uses this really powerful technique from the playwright Bertolt Brecht called historification. The idea is actually pretty simple. Take the struggles of today, the fight for a job, a political argument, a community's fear, and treat them with the same gravity you would a major historical event. When you do that, you reveal their true weight and their deeper meaning. So in Gun Island, the ancient myth of the gun merchant, this guy who's endlessly pursued by a vengeful goddess, fleeing from one disaster to another, is given exactly this treatment. It's not presented as some quaint piece of folklore, but as something absolutely vital and alive. Instead, it becomes this living metaphor for today's world. The merchant's flight becomes the story of the modern migrant fleeing climate change. The dangers he faces start to mirror the horrors of human trafficking. The myth gives us a powerful, human-scale language to talk about these overwhelming global crises. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway. To navigate the future, we can't just rely on data and scientific reports alone, and we can't rely only on stories and traditions. We need both. We need the data to tell us the facts, and we need the stories to help us understand what those facts actually mean for us as human beings. Which leaves us with a final and pretty urgent question. The crises we're all facing today will become the myths of tomorrow. So knowing that, are we telling the right stories? Or are we using the full power of both our reason and our imagination to navigate the world we've created? Because the answer to that, well, it's going to define the future.